Everybody, welcome back to Be Like Christ. Today I want to ask the question, who are or who were the Sadducees? If you've read the gospel accounts or the book of Acts, you've probably read about the Sadducees. They're not framed in a very good light. You know, they were enemies of Jesus and they were enemies of the early church. But who were they? Where did they come from historically? That's what I kind of dug into today, and I want to share some of that with you. You may be like me and think that the Sadducees play such a big role in the Gospels, in the story of Jesus, that they must be well accounted for in history. But that's actually not the case. There's very little information from extra-biblical historical sources as to where the Sadducees came from and how they grew up into power, even really what they believed. One of the best extra-biblical sources that we have is Josephus, and he was a historian that was born a couple years after the resurrection of Jesus. Most scholars think that the Pharisees were active in Jewish culture from about 130 BC to 70 AD when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Their name in Hebrew is Zadok. I'll put it right here, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right. But it originates from a man named Zadok, who was the high priest during the time of King David. A lot of what the Sadducees did centered around the temple in Jerusalem, and that's interesting because back all the way in the book of Ezekiel, which is about 600 years before Jesus, the sons of Zadok were actually put in charge of the holy things, the temple, because of their faithfulness to God when some of the other Jews had turned their backs on God. So anyway, now back to this guy named Josephus. What does he tell us in addition to what the Bible tells us about the Sadducees? Josephus mentions three prominent sects among the Jews during the first century. So there's the Pharisees, there's the Sadducees, and then there's a group called the Essenes. And there were other sects, but Josephus seems to present these kind of as the mainstream lines of thought within Judaism at that time. I wanted to pull directly from Josephus's writing, and I have a couple lengthy quotes here that I'm not going to read them all, but if you want to see all of them, you can take a look on our website, tobelikechrist.com, at the accompanying article to this video, and all of the information and the quotes are included in there, so if you're looking for the original source. So in his book, Antiquity of the Jews, Josephus tells us that these three sects, they didn't get along very well. They had major disagreements as far as the way that they viewed God and the nature of man. And a lot of the disagreement centered around whether or not man has free will. The Essenes thought that everything was controlled by God. It was all under the sovereignty of God. He made all of the decisions. The Pharisees were kind of the middle of the road. You know, they believed in the sovereignty of God, and they knew that God made some decisions, but then they also believed that some things were left up to the free will of men. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum from the Essenes, you had the Sadducees, who basically rejected the idea of God working in the world in any meaningful way. And just kind of a side note here, I thought it was really interesting that debate was happening in ancient Judaism, and really it's still happening in modern Christianity. You ever heard about Arminians and Calvinists? You know, it's kind of the same discussion. Josephus contrasts the Pharisees and the Sadducees in greater details in his book, The Jewish Wars. And I do want to read this passage, even though it's a little bit lengthy, because I think it's really helpful in understanding these groups. Now, of the two earlier groups, the Pharisees, who seem to expound the laws with precision and who lead the first sect, ascribe everything both to fate and to God, and while doing righteous deeds or not, depends for the most part upon men. Nonetheless, in each deed fate also helps, and every soul is indestructible, but only the soul of the good goes into another body, and those of the wicked are punished with an eternal punishment. And the Sadducees, the second group, do away with fate entirely, and they place God outside the act or the sight of any evil at all. And they say that both the doing of good and evil lies with the choice of men, and according to the knowledge of each, he turns to one or other of these. And they do away with the permanence of the soul and the punishments and the rewards of the underworld. And the Pharisees are both fond of one another and practice concord towards the public, but the Sadducees are rather fierce in their disposition even towards one another, and their dealings with those like them are as harsh as with foreigners. So if you didn't catch all that, let's break it down a little bit. So Josephus here tells us that, as we just mentioned, the Sadducees, they didn't believe in fate, they didn't believe in providence, to any great degree, kind of like a deist, that God created the world and now he has a hands-off approach. That was kind of their view. They believed that men chose to do good and evil according to their free will, and that God really didn't have a whole lot to do with either, choosing good or choosing evil. They did not believe that souls were eternal. They didn't believe that the wicked would be punished after death. So, the concept of hell, that wasn't in their vocabulary. And then Josephus tells us that they didn't even get along with members of their own party. So the Sadducees didn't get along together, and they didn't get along with anybody else. And he contrasts that with the Pharisees, who seemed to get along pretty well together, and they tried to make friends among the populace. When comparing the Pharisees and the Sadducees, it doesn't take very long to realize that these guys were philosophical and religious rivals. There was an old Jewish guy named John Hyrcanus, which is prominent before Jesus ever got to the earth. He was a ruler among the Jewish people. And while discussing a situation that surrounded him, Josephus shares even more details in his book, The Jewish Antiquities. The Pharisees and Sadducees also disagreed on another issue, and it was how binding the traditions of the rabbis were. Okay, so the Sadducees believed that only what was written down in the Torah, in God's written law delivered to Moses, only those things were binding and could be bound on first century Jews. The Pharisees disagreed, and the Gospels make this clear to us. They believed that there were all these traditions that their fathers had kind of come up with, the old rabbis, and that those also should be bound on the people. The Sadducees taught the people that they didn't have to listen to the Pharisees and all their made-up rules. And even Jesus in the Gospels condemns some of those rules and the way that they were bound, like hand-washing rituals and certain, made-up rules on the Sabbath day that God hadn't created. The Sadducees were really popular among the rich. They were kind of the elite class, whereas the Pharisees were more, middle class, you could say, and more popular among the multitudes of commoners. In his book Antiquities, Josephus also tells us that the Sadducees were more harsh in their judgments. They were more quick to pass down a punishment, a capital punishment for breaking the law, whereas the Pharisees were a little bit more gracious. And in the biblical text, Acts chapter 23, verses 7 and 8, tells us that the Sadducees didn't believe in angels or in spirits, whereas the Pharisees did. Seems like the Sadducees were much more secular than the other groups. Some suggested that they discarded the idea of miracles altogether. So anything that seemed too spiritual, too supernatural, too miraculous was kind of taboo for the Sadducees. And then the last little detail I'd like to share is that the Sadducees were much more open to Greek and Roman influence, or Hellenization. The Romans permitted the Sadducees to have some political power, and so it was kind of advantageous for the Sadducees to work alongside their Roman rulers so that they could hold on to that power. So if you have some extra time and you'd like to dig into some more of these resources, there's this article on tobelikechrist.com with all the quotations from Josephus, and there's a bunch of different material out there online. But again, you have to come back to this idea that there's not really a whole lot known about them. They're really missing from the historical record. Not altogether, but a lot of meaningful details that we would be curious about, they're just not there for our discovery, at least not until some more archaeological evidence gets dug up. But that's a general explanation of who the Sadducees were. So I hope that's been helpful to you.